The war was over, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the roar of any artillery. Across a shattered Europe, the ruins of the Third Reich lay smoking, the world just beginning to learn the full scope of its crimes. Yet in the shadows of these revelations, the women who had lived at the very center of Nazi power faced their own fates. Wives, lovers, and mistresses who had once stood beside the men who orchestrated some of history's darkest chapters. Their names were not etched in military orders or battlefield reports, but their stories remained tied inextricably to the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler's empire. They were called the Nazi princesses, women bound to the Reich not by command but by choice, loyalty, ambition, or fear. The camera of history first lingers on Eva Braun, the young woman who lived in secrecy as Adolf Hitler's companion for more than a decade. Born in 1912 in Munich to a middle-class Catholic family, she seemed destined for an ordinary life. Restless, spirited, and infatuated with glamour, Eva found herself working as an assistant in the photography studio of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. It was there, in 1929, that the 17-year-old met the man who would become her entire world. Hitler was already a rising political figure, carrying himself with theatrical self-importance. To Eva, he was a figure larger than life, a man with destiny carved upon his face. She was not political, nor deeply interested in ideology. What drew her in was the intoxicating pull of proximity to power, the sense that she was chosen to stand beside someone who promised to reshape the world. But Eva's life in Hitler's orbit was not one of freedom. She was hidden, kept in the shadows of the Berghof and behind the walls of Munich apartments, forbidden to appear publicly as his partner. She longed for recognition, for affection, for some trace of normalcy in a relationship defined by secrecy and Hitler's relentless obsession with his political mission. Twice she attempted suicide, once with a pistol, later with sleeping pills. Acts that seemed to be desperate pleas for acknowledgement rather than final farewells. Hitler responded not with tenderness, but with calculated reassurances, pulling her back just enough to keep her bound to him, never allowing her to step fully into the light. To the German people, she did not exist. While Eva Braun lived in the shadows of Hitler, another woman stood proudly and visibly at the heart of the Nazi elite, Magda Goebbels. Born Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl in 1901, Magda was raised in a fractured family, her early years marked by divorce and instability. Yet she grew into a striking woman with poise, charm, and a refined sense of style. She married industrialist Gunther Quandt, one of Germany's wealthiest men. But the union was loveless, and Magda soon sought a different path. Drawn to the rising tide of National Socialism, she immersed herself in the party. And in 1931 she married Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's fanatically loyal minister of propaganda. Together, Magda and Joseph Goebbels became the epitome of the Nazi power couple. Their home life was paraded as the model of the perfect German family. 6 blonde, smiling children raised under the watchful eyes of a devoted mother. Photographs of Magda with her daughters were used as propaganda tools, images crafted to represent the idyllic household that the regime promised every loyal German. Behind the facade, however, Magda's marriage was fractured. Joseph's infidelities were notorious. His affairs with actresses and secretaries an open wound in their relationship. Hitler himself intervened at times, forbidding divorce to maintain the image of unity. Magda endured humiliation, trapped in a gilded cage, but she remained fiercely devoted to Hitler, whom she saw as Germany's savior. Her loyalty would drive her to a decision that would horrify the world. The circle of Nazi wives extended further to Emmy Goring, a glamorous stage actress who became the second wife of Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal of the Luftwaffe. Emmy's marriage elevated her into the highest social strata of the Reich, where she reveled in luxury and ceremony. Unlike Eva Braun, Emmy Goring was often in the public eye, attending official events, receiving foreign dignitaries, and enjoying a life extravagance in the palatial Caron estate. She cultivated a reputation as a hostess and patron of the arts, but beneath the surface, she was deeply entangled in the corruption and greed of her husband's empire. Hermann Göring plundered art collections across occupied Europe, amassing treasures stolen from Jewish families and conquered nations. Emmy benefited from this looting, adorning her home and lifestyle with the spoils of war. For her, the Reich was not a shadowy prison, but theater of privilege, one that would collapse in ruin when the Allies closed in. Another figure, Karen Goring, Hermann's first wife, had died in 1931, long before the outbreak of war. Yet her memory remained a haunting presence in Goring's life. A Swedish aristocrat, Karen was frail in health, but unwavering in her devotion to Hermann. She had embraced National Socialism early, sharing his ambitions and his fervor. When she died of tuberculosis at the age of 42, Goring immortalized her memory, naming his grand estate Karen Hall in her honor. Karen became a kind of sainted figure in the Nazi mythology, her image woven into the narrative of sacrifice and loyalty. In death, she remained a symbol for Goring, a reminder of a personal devotion that contrasted sharply with the decadence and corruption of his later years. These women were not soldiers or policymakers, yet their fates were inseparable from the Reich's rise and fall. They lived in the epicenter of the storm, some passively carried along, others actively shaping the image of the Nazi state. The war magnified their choices, and as Germany's fortunes turned, the walls of privilege and secrecy that had sheltered them began to crumble. By 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Allied troops closed in from west and east. Cities lay in ruins, and Hitler retreated into the subterranean bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Eva Braun, now 33 years old, refused to flee. Against the pleas of friends and family, she insisted on joining Hitler in Berlin, determined to share his fate. For the first time, she stepped fully into her role, no longer hidden. In those final days, she lived openly at Hitler's side, the secret mistress finally acknowledged as his companion. On April 29, 1945, within the concrete walls of the bunker, Eva Braun became Eva Hitler. They were married in a brief civil ceremony, attended by Joseph Goebbels and other loyalists. Less than 40 hours later, she and Hitler were dead. He by gunshot, she by cyanide. Their bodies were burned in the garden above, consumed by fire as the Red Army advanced through Berlin. Magda Goebbels also descended into the bunker with her husband and children. For her, there was no life beyond Hitler's world. When the end became inevitable, she made a chilling choice. On May 1st, 1945, Magda and Joseph Goebbels poisoned their 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, one by one, as they lay sleeping in their beds. The following day, she and Joseph took their own lives. To Magda, life in a world without National Socialism was unthinkable. Her devotion was absolute. Her fate sealed not by ideology alone, but by a fanatical loyalty that consumed even her children. But what of those who did not descend into the bunker? Emmy Goring, spared the immediate collapse of Berlin, was captured by Allied forces. Stripped of her privileges, she faced trial not as a policymaker, but as the wife who had benefited from the regime's crimes. Her property was seized, her name tarnished, her life forever marked by her association with a man who presided over the Luftwaffe's terror and plunder. For her, survival meant living in the shadow of disgrace, a fall from opulence to obscurity. The story of the Nazi princesses did not end with their deaths or their trials. Their lives raised unsettling questions. How much did they know? How deeply were they complicit? How willingly did they embrace the privileges built on the suffering of millions? Some were sheltered in ignorance. Others turned a blind eye, and still others participated actively in sustaining the illusion of the Reich's greatness. Their legacies are stained, their fates tragic, their choices forever entwined with a regime that brought the world to the brink of ruin. Yet even as their stories seem to close, one more chapter looms. Not all the women tied to the Nazi elite vanished in fire or swallowed poison. Some lived on, carrying their secrets into the post-war world, reinventing themselves in new identities, leaving behind whispers of the lives they once led in the halls of power. Their names would resurface in trials, in memoirs, in the bitter memories of a world struggling to make sense of the unthinkable. And among them was one woman whose life after the war would prove stranger than fiction. Her survival, a haunting reminder that the shadows of the Reich did not vanish with its flames. She was born Ilse Prohl in 1900, a quiet and intelligent girl from Hanover, the daughter of a teacher, raised in the sober traditions of middle-class Germany. Her life would have likely remained unremarkable had she not crossed paths with a young, ambitious law student named Rudolf Hess. Their meeting in Munich in the 1920s tied her fate to a man, whose devotion to Adolf Hitler would make him one of the most infamous figures of the Third Reich. Rudolf Hess rose quickly, becoming Hitler's loyal deputy, a man so trusted that Hitler once called him the most loyal of loyal. Ilse stood at his side, dutiful and reserved, a figure far less flamboyant than Magda Goebbels or Emmy Goring. She bore Hess a son, Wolf Rudiger, and lived a life largely away from the public eye. But unlike Eva Braun, she was not hidden. Rather, she existed on the periphery, her husband's service to Hitler defining every aspect of her existence. Then, in May 1941, came the act that stunned the world. Without warning, Rudolf Hess climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighter plane and flew solo across the North Sea, landing by parachute in Scotland. His mission, as he explained, was to negotiate peace with Britain behind Hitler's back. The gambit was a disaster. Hess was arrested and imprisoned for the remainder of the war, considered insane by some, a traitor by others. For Ilse, the flight was a catastrophe. Overnight, she was branded the wife of a man who had broken with Hitler's command, and her life of privilege vanished. She spent the war years under surveillance, ostracized within the Nazi elite, her loyalty to her husband unwavering even as he rotted in British captivity. After the war, Rudolf Hess was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to life imprisonment in Spandau prison, where he would remain for more than 4 decades. Ilse Hess visited him faithfully, year after year, bringing their son, maintaining a bond that spanned iron bars and barbed wire. She lived quietly, refusing to renounce him, even as his name became a symbol of fanaticism and betrayal. When Hess died in 1987, officially by suicide though surrounded by controversy, Ilse lived to see their son fight to clear his father's name. Hers was not the flamboyant fate of Magda Goebbels, but a long, drawn-out tragedy of loyalty, isolation, and unyielding devotion. If Ilse Hess's life was marked by endurance, another story unfolds in darker hues, that of Lena Heydrich. Born Lena von Osten in 1911, she came from a family rooted in the nationalist traditions of northern Germany. Her marriage to Reinhard Heydrich in 1931 united her with one of the most feared men of the regime. Heydrich was the architect of the Holocaust, the ruthless head of the Reich Main Security Office, and the man Heinrich Himmler once called the man with the iron heart. Lena adored him. She embraced National Socialism with zeal, seeing in it not only political destiny, but personal advancement. She encouraged her husband's career, even after he was dismissed from the Navy for misconduct, urging him to join the SS. Together, they built a life of privilege, residing in a lavish estate in Prague after Germany's occupation of Czechoslovakia. Lena relished her role as the wife of a powerful SS commander, enjoying the trappings of wealth, status, and influence, while Reinhard orchestrated terror across Europe. But in 1942, retribution came. Czech resistance fighters, trained and supported by Britain, launched Operation Anthropoid. On May 27th, they ambushed Heydrich's car in Prague, fatally wounding him. His death was met with brutal reprisals. The massacre of Lidice, where an entire village was destroyed and its inhabitants murdered or deported. Lena, widowed at 31, did not retreat into grief. Instead, she embraced the image of a martyr's widow, raising her children in devotion to the memory of their father. After the war, she escaped execution, though she was tried for her Nazi associations. She served prison time, but later lived quietly in West Germany, unrepentant to the end. In interviews, she defended Reinhard, never acknowledging the horrors he had unleashed. The legacy of Lena Heydrich is chilling, a reminder that not all the wives of the Nazi elite were passive or ignorant. Some were believers, committed to the ideology, sharing responsibility in ways that cannot be erased by claims of domesticity. Her story stands as a stark contrast to others who later sought to distance themselves from the regime. Among those others was Gerda Bormann, the wife of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful figures in the Reich's inner circle. Gerda was born into a wealthy family and married Martin in 1929, binding herself to a man of extraordinary ambition. Bormann was ruthless, manipulative, and indispensable to Hitler, controlling access to the Führer, wielding power behind the scenes. Gerda admired his drive and fanatically supported National Socialism, embracing the regime's ideology with enthusiasm. Yet their marriage was far from tender. Martin Bormann was unfaithful, keeping mistresses and fathering children outside their union. With Goethe's knowledge and reluctant acceptance, she wrote letters expressing devotion to him and to Hitler, reflecting a fervor that went beyond ordinary loyalty. During the war, Goethe remained in the Bavarian Alps with their children, managing their household while her husband orchestrated the inner workings of the Reich. In May 1945, as Berlin fell, Martin Bormann vanished. For decades, his fate was a mystery, fueling speculation that he had escaped to South America or lived in hiding. It was only in 1972 that his remains were discovered in Berlin, confirming that he had died in the chaos of the city's fall. Goethe, however, never saw him again. She had been captured by American forces, her health failing from cancer. In 1946, she died at the age of 36. Far from her children, her life cut short in a foreign hospital. Her letters remain as haunting evidence of her devotion, a woman who tied her entire identity to her husband and to Hitler, leaving behind a legacy inseparable from fanaticism. These women, Ilse Hess, Lena Heydrich, Goethe Bormann, each revealed different shades of loyalty, complicity, and tragedy. Some clung to their husbands in defiance of the world's condemnation. Some reveled in the ideology and the privileges it brought. Others endured quietly, tethered to men whose names became synonymous with terror. As the Allies consolidated victory, the question of justice loomed large. The Nuremberg trials exposed the crimes of the regime in forensic detail, and the men of the Third Reich faced judgment. But what of their wives, mistresses, and companions? Some were interrogated, some imprisoned, others faded into obscurity. They were not the ones who signed orders or commanded armies, but they had lived in houses built on stolen wealth, worn jewels taken from Jewish families, raised their children in homes paved with suffering. Could innocence be claimed in the face of such proximity to evil? In the ruins of Germany, answers did not come easily. Trials for these women varied. Sentences were often light, and many returned to quiet lives, reshaping themselves as widows, mothers, or victims of circumstance. Yet their presence lingered, their stories woven into the larger tapestry of a nation's descent into barbarity. And still, one final group of women remained, those who had not been wives or dutiful mothers, but mistresses, lovers, and companions who hovered in the intimate shadows of the Nazi elite. Their relationships were whispered about, their roles less official, but their choices no less telling. As the Reich crumbled, their fates became entangled in escape, betrayal, and survival, with some vanishing into new lives while others faced a reckoning of history. Theirs would be a story not of devotion within marriage, but of passion, secrecy, and the desperate struggle to outrun the collapse of a world built on lies. In the final years of the Reich, when defeat crept ever closer, the hidden women of the Nazi elite, the mistresses and lovers who lived in the shadows, found themselves confronting choices as dangerous and revealing as those faced by the wives. These women, though lacking the titles of Frau Goebbels or Frau Göring, had shared the tables, the estates, the banquets of the regime. They too had tasted the intoxicating blend of fear and privilege, and when the end came, their lives were swept into the same storm. One of the most striking among them was Hedwig Pothast, the longtime mistress of Heinrich Himmler. Born in 1912, Hedwig was raised in Cologne and worked as a secretary before entering the inner circles of the SS. There she caught the eye of Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer SS, the man who oversaw the Gestapo, the concentration camps, and the mass extermination of millions. Himmler was already married to Margaret Boden, with whom he had a daughter, but his marriage was distant and cold. Margaret was increasingly sidelined, left in the countryside, while Himmler built his secret life with Hedwig. Hedwig bore Himmler 2 children, a son and a daughter, and for years lived quietly in houses arranged by the SS, shielded from public view, but well cared for. She was not a political figure, but her existence reflected the hypocrisy of the Nazi elite. Himmler, who preached strict moral discipline for the German people, maintained his mistress and illegitimate children without hesitation. Those close to him knew of her, and within the small world of SS elites, it was no secret. When the Reich collapsed, Hedwig's life of security shattered. Himmler attempted to negotiate with the Allies, seeking to save himself, but was captured and committed suicide by biting down on a cyanide capsule in May 1945. Hedwig fled with her children, trying to carve out a new life. Unlike Magda Goebbels or Gerda Bormann, she did not follow her lover into death. She survived, remarried, and lived in obscurity until her death in 1997. For her children, the legacy was heavier. A father remembered as one of the chief architects of genocide, a mother remembered as his silent companion. Elsewhere, the story of Annie Reborn, the wife of SS officer Karl Wolff, carried its own dark resonance. A former Olympic swimmer, Annie embodied the Nazi ideal of health and athleticism. Her marriage to Wolff, Himmler's chief of staff, tied her to one of the regime's most influential figures. Yet Wolff himself was notorious for his affairs, living openly with mistresses even as he remained married. For women like Annie and Hedwig, the Nazi inner world was rife with infidelity, secrecy, and duplicity, betrayals mirrored in the very system their men served. But while some women endured humiliation in silence, others sought to escape the Reich entirely. One such woman was Inga Ley, the wife of Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front. Inga was young, glamorous, and reportedly unstable, trapped in a marriage to a man notorious for corruption, drunkenness, and violent outbursts. Robert Ley, who oversaw the exploitation of millions of forced laborers, lived in a haze of alcohol and decadence, his behavior increasingly erratic as the war dragged on. For Inga, life with him was unbearable. In 1942, she took her own life, leaving behind a note that spoke of despair and hopelessness. Hers was one of the earliest cracks in the facade of Nazi domestic life, a glimpse of the toll exacted even within the gilded walls of privilege. Not all mistresses ended in tragedy. Some survived and even managed to reinvent themselves in the post-war years. Women like Himmler's Hedwig Pothast or Göring's lovers faded into obscurity, rarely speaking of their past, building new lives under new names. Their silence, however, raises haunting questions. How much did they know of the crimes committed by the men they loved? How deeply were they complicit in sustaining the illusion of normalcy, the comforts of domestic life that hid the machinery of mass murder? Meanwhile, the collapse of the Reich brought with it a spectacle of reckoning. Emmy Göring, once the dazzling hostess of Karen Hall, stood before Allied judges. Though she was not charged with war crimes, she was tried as a beneficiary of the regime, her fortune stripped, her title gone. She would spend the rest of her life marked not by diamonds and gala halls, but by the disgrace of her name. The trials and interrogations revealed something crucial. The women of the Nazi elite often minimized their knowledge, claiming ignorance, insisting they were only wives or lovers with no power. Yet evidence showed they had attended banquets where Jewish families had been stripped of their homes, lived in estates filled with stolen art, and signed letters professing not just loyalty to their husbands, but devotion to Hitler himself. The Nazi princesses were not, for the most part, innocent bystanders. They were part of a world built on theft, blood, and terror. Still, their fates varied dramatically. Eva Braun chose to die with Hitler, her devotion sealed in fire. Magda Goebbels killed her own children in blind loyalty to the Führer. Gerda Bormann died young, consumed by illness and ideology. Lena Heydrich lived on unrepentant, defiantly defending her husband's name. Hedwig Pothast survived quietly into the modern age, carrying with her the secret of a life lived in the shadow of Himmler. Ilse Hess endured decades of isolation, bound forever to a husband in prison for life. As the 1950s dawned, Germany sought to rebuild from ruins, its people grappling with guilt, silence, and denial. The women who had once been at the center of the Reich's private world walked among them, some recognizable, others anonymous, all bearing stories that cut to the heart of what it meant to live in complicity. They were reminders that evil does not exist only in the proclamations of leaders or the commands of generals, but also in the quiet acceptance of those who share their tables, raise their children, and close their eyes to the truth. And yet, one final reckoning awaited. For if the Nazi princesses' lives were shaped by loyalty, privilege, and downfall, their legacies would echo far beyond their deaths. Children grew up bearing their names, struggling to reconcile with fathers remembered as murderers and mothers remembered as loyalists. Post-war Germany confronted them, sometimes with hostility, sometimes with indifference. And history itself, relentless in its pursuit, continued to unearth their letters, their photographs, their testimonies, haunting fragments of lives entwined with the darkest regime of the 20th century. But before the curtain can fall on their story, there remains one last ascent into the ruins. The question of what their choices mean for us today. Were they victims of circumstance or willing accomplices? Can love, loyalty, or ignorance absolve those who stood beside monsters? And most chilling of all, what does their survival or their destruction reveal about the seductive power of ideology when it is woven into the fabric of family, loyalty, and devotion? The answer waits in the final act of their tale, where death, survival, and memory collide in ways that would shape not only their lives but the conscience of a nation. The ruins of Berlin smoldered in May 1945. The Reich reduced to rubble. But the story of the women who had lived within its heart did not end with surrender. For decades after the war, the fates of the so-called Nazi princesses continued to ripple outward, shaping memory, shaping families, shaping the very struggle of Germany to confront its past. Their lives became fractured mirrors, each reflecting a different facet of complicity, denial, and survival. Eva Braun was ash. Her life ended in the bunker. She left behind no children, no diary reflection, only fragments of photographs and film reels that painted her as a woman who loved dogs, sunshine, and the camera's lens. For years, her existence was denied in official narratives, a footnote to Hitler's life, until captured documents revealed the truth of her long companionship. She had not been a political figure, yet her choice to follow Hitler into death sealed her legacy as a woman who chose love, or obsession, over the reality of the millions who suffered outside her idyllic retreats at the Berghof. Magda Goebbels, remembered as the First Lady of the Reich, was despised after the war as the woman who murdered her 6 children in devotion to Hitler. To survivors of the Third Reich, she became a haunting symbol of fanaticism carried to its ultimate extreme, a reminder that ideology could consume even the most intimate bonds of family. Survivors of the Lidice massacre and Jewish prisoners liberated from camps spoke of her name with horror, unable to reconcile the image of a mother with the act of infanticide. Emmy Goring emerged from prison with her wealth confiscated, reduced to living modestly, far from the lavish halls of Karen Hall. She spent her post-war years quietly, her daughter Etta by her side, always defending Hermann Goring against his accusers, insisting that history had misunderstood him. Her words rang hollow in a world where the crimes of the Luftwaffe and Goring's theft of art and treasure were documented in staggering detail. She lived until 1973, never shaken from her devotion, her name forever tied to luxury bought with blood. Ilse Hess carried her devotion like a cross for decades. She visited Rudolf in Spandau prison, their only son Wolf Rudiger joining her, until Hess's death in 1987. She had no other identity, her life defined solely by her loyalty to a man condemned as a war criminal who himself refused to repent. Ilse died in 1995, an old woman whose world had never escaped the shadow of 1941, when her husband's desperate flight to Scotland had sealed his fate. Gerda Bormann never saw the post-war decades. Her letters to Martin, drenched in loyalty to Hitler and to the Reich, remain among the most disturbing testimonies of Nazi women's devotion. She died young, only 36, her life consumed by illness, leaving behind children who grew up fatherless, their family name a curse. For them, the burden of being a Bormann meant suspicion, isolation, and an inheritance of silence. Lena Hayter survived the longest and perhaps left the most troubling legacy. After serving a sentence for her Nazi associations, she moved to the island of Fehmarn in northern Germany, where she ran a guest house. Tourists came and went, often unaware that the woman serving them was once the wife of Reinhard Heydrich, the butcher of Prague, the architect of the final solution. Lena defended him until her death in 1985, calling him a good husband, a good father, a man misunderstood by history. She never expressed remorse, never admitted the scale of his crimes. For her, the Reich never truly died. Hedwig Pothis, Himmler's mistress, slipped into anonymity, dying in 1997. Her children bore the shame of their father's name, struggling to reconcile their lives with the legacy of a man who embodied genocide. Unlike Lena Heydrich, Hedwig kept her silence, rarely speaking, as if silence itself might erase the weight of memory. These women's lives did not shape policy, but they shaped the image of the Reich, and in their devotion, their silence, their complicity, they became part of its machinery. They dressed in gowns bought with looted wealth, lived in houses seized from deported Jews, enjoyed privileges built on slave labor. Their hands did not sign orders, but they accepted the world those orders created. Post-war Germany wrestled with them uneasily. Some were vilified, some were ignored. Others were treated with a strange pity as widows trapped by history. But their legacies cannot be severed from the men they chose, the ideology they embraced, or the silence they maintained. Their children inherited names heavy with guilt, some choosing to speak out, others choosing to hide. To this day, the question lingers, what did these women know, and what does it mean that they chose to remain? The story of the Nazi princesses forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Evil does not thrive only through dictators and generals. It thrives through the silent acceptance of those who share the banquet table, who look away while others are destroyed, who choose loyalty and comfort over conscience. These women were not uniform in their choices. Some fanatical, some broken, some merely passive. But together they illustrate the spectrum of human weakness in the face of power. And so the final image lingers, Magda Goebbels cradling her sleeping children in the bunker, preparing poison capsules. Eva Braun in her wedding gown of black silk, knowing death waits only hours away. Lena Heydrich smiling at guests in her seaside inn, unrepentant in her defense of her husband. Ilse Hess still walking to the gates of Spandau, year after year. Each carried their fate into history, each bound forever to a Reich that promised eternity, but delivered only ruin. Their lives are not curiosities nor footnotes. They are warnings. Warnings that devotion, loyalty, and silence have become accomplices to atrocity. Warnings that ideology, once allowed to seep into the bonds of family and love, can consume even the most intimate sanctuaries of human life. The world they built turned to ashes, but their stories remain, a testament to how deeply the poise of the Third Reich penetrated not only politics and armies, but homes, marriages, and the most private of lives. The war ended in 1945, but the echoes of the Nazi princesses carried far beyond. Their names remind us that history is not only written in the speeches of tyrants and the report of soldiers, but also in the choices of those who stood beside them, those who loved them, those who refused to look away. And in their choices lies the most haunting truth of all, that the darkness of the Reich was not only the work of men, but a world sustained by women who embraced it, endured it, or refused to resist it until the end.